Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we are finally going to be talking about the newest album, the sophomore album from Vince Staples, called Big Fish Theory. I have a hard time getting a grip on what Vince Staples is doing most of the time, and I don't think I'm the only one here. Like most people, I started getting into him through his 2014 EP, Hell Can Wait, and its relentless, hard-hitting darkness, tinged with a frank gallows humor where the edge was only further intensified by how close it all hit home for him. It was his reality. The language was blunt, the production was stripped down and lean. By the time he released his viciously sharp double album titled Summertime '06, I was all set to get on board full-time. And yet, unlike so many critics, I wasn't really quite taken in. Maybe I was expecting the curt lyricism to build up to a little bit more, maybe show a little bit more refinement, not drop as many rhymes. Maybe the production was in fact too stripped down to really stick with me, not quite melodic enough. Maybe it's that Vince Staples delivered an hour-long double album for his debut that probably should have been trimmed back in order to add a little bit more density to these songs. Look, I remember liking the album a fair bit, but I didn't love it, and I still don't. And yet from there, I got the impression that Vince wasn't one to stick around with that sort of sound. And when I heard that his follow-up this year, Big Fish Theory, was attracting some controversy for pivoting more towards hip house and Detroit techno, well, there was a part of me that wasn't all that surprised, especially given that his style would probably complement the blunt, nihilistic themes of his lyricism fairly well. Hell, I had heard how well he had worked opposite Gorillaz earlier this year, and this sound on this record was probably aiming to be a little bit more ragged and experimental in that vein, so okay, what did we manage to hook on Big Fish Theory? Well, this is one of those projects that, like Vince Staples himself, seems to actively resist analysis. Not quite the active trolling of the audience and critics that was Do What Thou Wilt from Ab-Soul last year, but I think it's a much more apt comparison than everybody trying to draw parallels with Yeezus, although, just like with that album, the production was an abrasive left turn that ultimately didn't feel nearly as shocking or boundary pushing as so many people have said it is. And I think that roughly parallels my feelings on Big Fish Theory as a whole. For sure, it's an interesting project that on an instrumental level will certainly challenge the mainstream hip-hop listener who haven't heard of Missy Elliott yet. But while there are potent ideas here that I like seeing explored, at the end of the day, I repeatedly found myself underwhelmed time after time going back through it, and I'm still trying to untangle why that really is. I don't think it's one big factor, I think it's a number of little things. But first, let me start off with the things that I unquestionably like about this, most of which surrounds Vince Staples himself. Without question, he has a distinctive voice and presence on this album, and his bars were significantly tightened and tuned up comparison to some of his sloppiness that crept onto Summertime '06. And considering the emotional tightrope that this album is trying to walk, that is saying a lot. I really appreciate that. It's very clear that while the last album was somewhat backwards looking, this record is much more focused on Vince Staples' current state. Having found success and fame and a way out of a violent past, he's asking, what now? And he doesn't really have time for many of the answers that he's being given. It's a similar sort of pragmatism that I remember coming through on YG's Still Brazy, and we're really quite liking it there. But Vince Staples, he's much more mischievous. So he's gonna deconstruct and rip apart the veils of success and the lifestyle porn pushed by many wealthy rappers, most because he knows that it's not really making them or him happy. He's not gonna deny that it's given him some security, sure, but when he includes an extended sample of Amy Winehouse describing her artistic process and how self-destructive that it can feel, it's hard not to think that Vince Staples sees himself as something of a kindred spirit to it, especially on this project. Of course, some of that nuke my career from orbit tone might be partially mirrored in some of the production, which opts for abrasive, rubbery synths, rigid drum machines that pull from the bass-heavy knock of trap to Detroit techno and footwork, and synth tones that range from your watery G-funk to the unstable howling warps that are a pretty blatant indicator that yes, he got Sophie at PC Music for some of this production. And while the mainstream might be able to groove to some of these hooks, overall the Juicy J assist on Big Fish is pretty damn catchy. The more opulent G-funk trap fusion of 745, and especially the Rick Ross interpolation on Homage that I actually really liked. I also wouldn't be surprised if some of this production had them running for the hills screaming. The frigid, windswept groove with choppy vocal fragments on Crabs in a Bucket, the bassy house glitch of Love Can Be with Damon Albarn, and especially any of the hollow shrieking and bassy contributions on Samo and Yeah Right. It was definitely a left field move, and yet I kept waiting to be surprised or really grabbed by a lot of this production, and that just didn't quite happen for me. Now, I wouldn't say I actively disliked any of it. I'm an easy sell on G-Funk, and after a fashion, the distorted bass didn't really faze me all that much, but just like with Summertime '06, I found myself wishing that these didn't feel so bare bones and lacking in a strong melodic foundation. I won't deny that the percussion and a lot of the synth pick up plenty of texture and bite, but at the root of it, maybe Vince Staples wouldn't have to rely on such lyrically simplistic and repetitive hooks if he let some of these synths carry more of a consistent tune. And again, while Vince Staples, he's pulled on some really good producers, I can't be the only one who steps back and hears this and thinks that if Missy Elliott was still consistently releasing music, it would sound a lot like this. It's not all that groundbreaking. Now granted, that might be more tied to general issues that I personally have with hip house and this sort of techno-driven production in hip hop. I remember saying similar things about Azealia Banks 3 years ago when I covered her debut, but that's not really what's keeping me from embracing this album altogether, and I think for that we need to return to the content and a lot of the lyrics. And again, I like a lot of what Vince Staples is doing here artistically. For one, just like on Summertime '06, his usage of Kilo Kush is inspired. Playing to the bored, dismissive LA rich brat that'll screw Vince Staples for his money, but really just treats him as disposable and is not willing to engage with any real darkness that might underscore a lot of his content. Right from the opening track, she bluntly says she forgot to care, and she'd like him to avert his gaze from her. Or on Love Can Be, she wants to make plenty of memories on Daddy's yacht, but never any more real connection for him. And while you could make the argument that Vince Staples comes right up to the line of misogyny by how frequently he characterizes women like this, especially on 745, in truth, he's making a larger point about people's obsession with image and veneer in hip-hop rather than confronting what might be at the root of the issues, comfortably revisiting the same old party over and over again, the same old song, and swallowing the same shallow luxury porn that to Vince Staples just seems utterly wasteful. He sees no use in it. And while I will say it was kind of inspired to get A$AP Rocky on Samo to emphasize that point given A$AP Rocky's content, a little less so to get Kendrick Lamar to play foil on Yeah Right, where I wasn't exactly over the moon by Kendrick's verse, but it's also very telling that on some songs, Vince Staples, he is participating in that same hip-hop climate, and you could argue that he's perpetuating much of the same image, just against more experimental production. And you know what? I think he knows that too. Now, this is where many people, and indeed many critics, have highlighted very nihilistic themes in Vince Staples' work. And yet, I've never been totally on board with that. Both this record and Summertime '06 might seem bleak or nihilistic, that nothing matters, so might as well enjoy what you can, but they reflect depression and a very sober reality for him. And you can tell that Vince Staples is trying to use his music as both to confront that reality, showcase it for everyone else, and maybe find something better going forward outside of that system. And yet, that is a conclusion more supported by subtext than actual text on Big Fish Theory. Part of it is that it can feel a little bit blunt and underwritten, frequently clever, sure, but not quite as hard-hitting as it thinks, especially when there are points on already pretty short songs like Rain Come Down, where Vince Staples would just repeat a verse altogether. I was expecting a little more from him there. But then you have tracks like BagBak, where Vince, he gets a little bit more political and says he won't vote unless another black man runs. I mean, I get fighting a broken system, but having the privilege of enough money to not need to engage, that's sort of nihilism that I find incredibly tiresome and completely unhelpful. Maybe that's just at the root of it all. While the hopeful subtext and subversion's why I get that, so much of the actual text of this album doesn't contribute to this, and further divorced from it feels deeper consequences beyond Vince himself. It just becomes a lot harder to justify, and honestly, like most nihilistic art for me, just starts to feel a little bit tedious. I just don't get sucked into it in the same way. But beyond all that, let me stress that I do like this album. I don't love it though. The production is potent, but doesn't really grip me as much as I would like. And once you get a rough handle on what Vince Staples is trying to say, it doesn't quite feel as clever as I would like, basically doing thematically much of what Clipping did to much greater effect on their self-titled album 3 years ago. But it is a promising project and showcases a ton of talent and ingenuity coming from Vince Staples going forward. I want to see more records from him like this, with a little bit more polish. For me, light 7 out of 10, recommendation, but a bit of a cautious one. These sorts of subversive projects, they can be a tough sell, especially given how the sound has shifted in comparison with previous work. But hey, we need troublemakers like Vince Staples, and with projects like this, he's trying to keep people on their toes, and I respect that. So yeah, check it out. You won't regret it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If you're wondering why I sound so hoarse, I got a bit of a catch in my throat. Not sure what's causing it. Hope I'm not getting sick. That would just really suck. Beyond that, if you guys want to buy the album, links in the description below, and I got the poll up there. I'm curious where Vince Staples fans fall on this. I know I'm being a little bit more negative than most critics, but I can imagine that there are some people who didn't quite hop on board with the same sound, or maybe just didn't gravitate to the themes in the same way. I'm curious what people are going to have to say. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get more involved in my scheduling process, so I could have covered this, say, like 2 weeks ago, link to my Patreon right there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week you guys get to add albums or even movies to my schedule if you're in the higher tiers. More details right there, but till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.